Hello and welcome. I'm Milla Mäkinen, singer, voice teacher, and yoga teacher based in Helsinki, Finland. In this podcast, Motor Preferences in Singing, I explore how functional neuroscience can transform the way we teach singing. Today, I want to share how I first discovered motor preferences and how it led me into a completely new way of thinking about singing. Motor preferences has its roots in sports. Back in 1989, volleyball coaches Bertrand Trerlat and Ralph Ippolit began experimenting with how the brain influences movement and posture individually. Here in Finland, one version of this method was introduced by Marko Siivonen. He was the one through whom I first heard about it, and from that point, my own journey began to slowly unfold, now about 4 years ago. I discovered motor preferences almost by accident. I was not actually looking for answers to any challenges I had in singing. By that point, I had already accepted the idea that I simply had the wrong kind of body for top-level singing, and that there was no way to get any further with my voice than where I already was. I had made my peace with that, or at least I thought I had. I went to my first session purely on someone else's recommendation. I did not even really know where I was going. I was just told, "You should go. It's really unusual and interesting." So I went. My first session was unforgettable. I walked out thinking, this is what I have been missing. These are the answers to questions I did not even know how to ask. From that day on, I could not stop wondering how this could reach musicians too. Because once you see how your motor preferences drives movement, you cannot unsee it. Do I think that us voice teachers should become neuroscientists? No. But even just being aware of motor preferences changes how we think about posture, coordination, and learning. One realization hit me hard. So many of the tips I had been given in singing lessons over the years were actually influencing motor output. We just did not have the words of the framework to describe it. And we did not know that those tips might affect people differently. For example, I was often asked to let my hands rest by my sides. I always wondered why I could not manage that while singing. But now I know. Part of my motor preferences is that my core activates way better when my elbows are slightly away from my torso. Another example. I always told my students to keep a long neck. Why? Because it worked for me, and it fit the universal image of what good posture looks like. I had no idea that not everyone can reach their best motor output in the same neck alignment. So naturally, I wanted to learn more. After the first excitement, I quickly hit a wall. Where could I find more information? I took an inspiring course here in Finland, but I still lacked a bridge between the scientific foundation and the practice. And I discovered Kari Niemi and his online lecture on the vestibular system. Through him, I found Z-Health and their courses. Around the same time, I came across Vålådalen in Switzerland. Their material, and later also material through motor preferences experts in the US, helped me connect the dots. My knowledge of different sports is honestly quite limited. But because the method is so often taught through the lens of various sports, I have done my best to familiarize myself with them too, just enough to understand the underlying principles. You have to meet it where it lives. But does sport translate directly to singing? Not exactly, but the principles of movement, coordination, motor output, they absolutely carry over. As I started sharing what I had found, I also started getting pushback. In the beginning, my enthusiasm sometimes backfired because people would say, if this method were really that good, I would already know about it. And I get it. The field is still new. Information about these methods is not easily available. When I started my journey 4 years ago, most of it was in French. Different branches use different terms and do not necessarily communicate with each other. From the outside, it can look very fragmented and confusing. And I made my own share of mistakes along the way. Sometimes I enjoyed the wow factor too much, making motor preferences assessment look like magic. But it is not magic. My wish is simply that knowledge about what affects motor output and how situational and individual that is gets spread. I have no reason to talk about these methods as if they were some kind of cult or religion. That is also why I find it healthy to learn from many different sources. When I notice that something works in practice, I take it as a useful tool worth examining further. Before I see practical use, I think this is interesting, but I do not lock it in my mind as the truth. I also stepped into the trap of trying to learn too much too fast. I want to help my students, I want to sing better myself, I want to develop practical tools to share with musicians. But if I only read and study without trying things out in practice, I cannot move forward. And these methods, they can get very complex. In a real voice lesson, with a real student in front of me, how many exercises or instructions is it realistic to use at once? Not that many. So I had to go back to basics, and through mistakes I learned what is essential early on and what belongs later in the process. And there is a lot to learn. But I cannot master it all right away, nor apply everything to my students. The key was to narrow my own toolbox while still staying curious and learning more. A more personal mistake. I tried to hold my best posture all the time, forcing myself into my motor preferences profile. But the brain does not want one static posture. It wants variety, readiness, adaptability. Another mistake. I thought I could finally teach without bias, but I still filter everything through my own body and perspective, and that is okay. You just need to be aware of it. Motor preferences makes you less biased as a teacher, but I do not believe anyone is completely free from it. All of this has changed how I see my role as a teacher. Now I see my job not as providing all the answers, but as helping students take responsibility for their own process. When I was a young classical singing student, I did not know how to do that. I just followed authority, and I was torn between conflicting advice. That is why I love this saying, a teacher can point where to look, but not tell you what you will see. Let me also talk about the moments when things do not go smoothly in the assessment itself. Most of the time, the benefits of finding a student's motor preferences are obvious. You can see or hear them instantly, but sometimes the results are not clear. That has happened surprisingly rarely, though. But if it happens, at first I think, maybe I got the assessment wrong. I repeat it, but if no coherent posture emerges, I have to shift my approach. Instead of pushing, I slow down, I watch how the student's body naturally aligns. I avoid over-instructing and focus on what already feels possible and enjoyable. Sometimes the block is not in the body alone, it is in the mind. Some students refuse to try anything outside their belief system. Others are so used to strong conscious muscle commands that they cannot let go of control. but too much control defeats the purpose of motor preferences. And this is perhaps one of the most important lessons the method has taught me. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. We are very good at receiving instructions and training them into our system until they become automatic. But if someone has become exceptionally good at following cues from authorities, it can mean that listening to their own body has quietly taken a back seat. And when that happens, working with motor preferences profile can slow down because the person wants to hold on to their old beliefs about what has worked before and what their teacher has told them is correct. So many things I used to treat as universal truths have turned out in the end to be just one instruction among many. One that happens to work well for some people. When you can let go of those fixed ideas, it becomes possible to discover entirely new dimensions of your own body. Things you did not know were available to you. And it is genuinely frightening to let go of the habits on which you have built your entire professional practice. So I am not at all surprised that not everyone has the energy or the desire to explore this perspective, because it is a significant reconstruction process, and it does require its own motivation and its own resources. You have to want it enough to go through the uncomfortable middle part. This brings me to something I think is one of the most important and also underaddressed issues in singing education. We are all on a continuum where one end is rehabilitation and the other is high performance. Profiling your motor preferences can sure guide you toward high performance. But if someone is still closer to the rehab side, the first step is rehabilitation. I told you in the previous episode about my professional studies to become a classical singer and how I regressed in technique despite having wonderful teachers. In terms of motor output, my body was closer to the rehabilitation side of the continuum, but the teaching I received was aimed straight at high performance. That mismatch is something we need to address. Opera education is extremely expensive. Competition for arts funding is fierce. We cannot afford to waste time and resources. There has to be coherence between how we teach and where students actually are on this continuum of rehabilitation to high performance. Imagine someone tells you they studied cello professionally, but throughout their entire training, their instrument was missing the G string. Of course, they still learned things. They were immersed in music, they built connections, they became genuinely skilled on the 3 remaining strings. Maybe their bow technique is excellent. But it is still a cello without its 4th string. Now imagine that person competing for an audition against cellists who had a complete instrument throughout their studies. Does the person who trained without a full instrument have a realistic chance in an extremely competitive field? In my own case, this, I admit, a bit childish allegory turns out to be quite accurate. My jaw joints were not functioning properly, and because of that, the whole area was compromised. In a real sense, I was developing my instrument without all the pieces in place. And what creates the sound for an opera singer? It happens in the vocal tract. To master the vocal tract, you need to be able to coordinate your jaw and tongue, among other things. Those are essential factors when you want to shape resonance. That coordination is at the core of the instrument itself. I think that even within the singing world, we often resist seeing our bodies as instruments, even though we do say things like, we are athletes and our body is our instrument. Sure, we say those things, but without enough actual knowledge about how that instrument works. So the first step before you give education to a singer is to make sure the instrument is there and functioning, that the person has the possibility to develop and coordinate it. Of course, that is a lot to ask. It requires multi-professional involvement. It can be expensive, and sure, it is not yet mainstream. The voice is such a complete, interconnected system that you cannot really separate its parts and address them in isolation. And that wholeness creates a genuine challenge in our field. It is difficult to know where universal technique ends and individual body begins. Some things can be taught from research, principles that apply to everyone. But on top of those, there is each person's individual way of processing and producing sound, shaped by the unique physiology and nervous system. We tend to mix those things together because the line between them is genuinely blurry. But there is no well-functioning technique without a well-functioning body underneath it. And when one teacher tries to address all of that at once, they are often guessing. Students end up in knots because their teacher is describing a technical outcome or a universal principle without accounting for the individual body that has to produce it. I had no idea that my own problems were fixable. And I'm so grateful to have had the chance to work with Kariniemi. His Z-health-based interventions, they really helped me reach a high-performance state in my body. So now I could finally start the kind of training that actually leads to results and progress. Because I believe that too often we settle at the level we are at without knowing there are ways to move forward. That step up does not happen through repetitions alone or through technical knowledge. It happens when you understand the brain and where you are on that continuum of rehabilitation to high performance. And of course that takes time. And I sometimes wonder how many people would truly commit to brain-based training just to learn to sing. Few are patient enough to build a foundation first, and this is not just about beginners. But I know that professionals benefit enormously from this as well. In fact, maybe even more, because small improvement at the high level can make a world of difference. I want to end today's episode with something I have not yet told you, what actually brought me to motor preferences in the first place. Although this podcast is called Motor Preferences in Singing, I have clearly branded myself as a singer and voice teacher and yoga teacher. I did not find these methods through singing. I was not thinking they could improve my voice. Before I was a singer, I was an instrumentalist. I played classical guitar from a young age. Anyone who has spent time around classical musicians, especially instrumentalists, knows that one of the real challenges of the profession is ergonomics. It is extremely common for players to suffer from pain and various physical problems. Many end up changing careers because the body simply cannot sustain hours of daily practice. And that is what happened to me. Before I had put in the necessary practice hours, my body was already in a very strained state. Eventually I had to stop playing entirely for a year because my right hand would hurt the moment I tried to pick up the guitar. Throughout that time, I felt ashamed of my body, and I convinced I had the wrong technique. It was a relief to learn later, through motor preferences framework, that the situation was not that straightforward. The technique required for guitar playing simply cannot develop if the body is already aligned in the way that creates compensations. The traditional classical guitar position does not suit my motor preferences profile at all. And that was visible through the first motor preferences assessment I had. Then I adjusted my playing position slightly, just enough to activate my primary muscle change, and remarkably quickly, the pain in my right hand disappeared. And now I can play gigs of 3 hours or more with no problems at all, and I would have never believed my body was capable of that. So I found this method first through guitar, through a physical problem. And when it changed my playing so dramatically, I started wondering, could these same principles work in singing too? And I still remember exactly where I was. I aligned my body according to my profile and tried singing a vocal exercise. I immediately understood that what I had received was not just advice for playing an instrument or for sports, because everything we do with the body works through the nervous system. By working with my motor preferences, I could influence my nervous system and through that my muscles. And that gives a completely different starting point for developing technique. Because my nervous system was not in an optimal state for repetition-based practice, technique could not develop, and that was my missing piece. I have since worked with instrumentalists as well using this method, and because I was already a voice teacher, it has been natural to focus my development work on singing, but the same principles apply to instruments. I have learned more about this from colleagues who work with the same approach. Erja Joukamo-ampuja, a French horn lecturer, and violinist Laura Saarinen. They confirm that the results are just as significant as what I have observed with my singing students. Thank you for listening. I am always happy to hear from you. So if you have any questions or you want to share your experiences, please reach out. If you would like to join my coaching, feel free to contact me. I also give lectures and workshops for groups. And if you would like to know your own motor preference or that of your students, I would be happy to come and do assessments. In the next episode, I will introduce the different motor preferences profiles and how they affect power and coordination in singing.